If you make a triangle between Tel Aviv on the coast, Jerusalem kind of down in the middle, you go north of Jerusalem, you hit Arielle, you go east of Tel Aviv, you hit Arielle as well. You see that? Okay? Arielle is equidistant between the natural borders of Israel. On the one hand, the Jordan River, on the other hand, the Mediterranean Sea. I say natural borders of Israel because there actually aren't, to this day, clear borders for the state of Israel. There aren't clear borders for the state of Israel. When we say settlements, when we say West Bank, neither of those are terms that I'm comfortable using. I refer to the region where we are right now as Judea and Samaria. Ronnie mentioned it before, we're in Samaria. What does that mean? So we're going to do a quick synopsis, and again, questions as you feel comfortable. So we have to remember that Israel is not an afterthought to the Holocaust. Israel isn't a modern day invention. Israel is a return, an ingathering of exiles who for thousands of years were not permitted to be here or establish their commonwealth. So back in biblical times, this area was referred to as Judea and Samaria, and there's all sorts of biblical characters that lived and walked around these areas. If you're familiar with scripture, you'd be familiar with the names of the places around you. That's where the historic terminology Judea, Samaria is born. Fast forward to 1947, before the establishment of the State of Israel. 1947, the international community under the United Nations is trying to figure out what are we going to do with Tova. You there? Can we try to get the lights back on? You just give a holler up there. Thank you. What are we, the international community, not the people living in Israel, going to do with Israel? After all, we, the international community, promised to establish the state of Israel a Jewish state. A Jewish state not only including all of this area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, but also further to the east. Modern day Jordan was supposed to be part of the Jewish state. It's very confusing though, because the term used back in 1917, 1920, and 1922, first in the Balfour Declaration, then in the San Remo Conference of the League of Nations, was not Israel, it was called the British Mandate for Palestine. Today we think that Palestine is designed to be an Arab state, but Palestine, the original term Palestine, was associated with what would be a Jewish state. So very, very confusing. We haven't even gotten to 2018 and we're already confused. Jenny, I'll give you a holler when we're ready for the video, okay? No, not just yet. I'll let you know.
I don't have to go up yet?
Not yet. No, you can breathe. Poor Jenny. She's working very hard, folks. There's a lot of people involved in making sure that your visit is a success. Thank you, Jenny. I'll let you know. So we've already confused ourselves. So let's try to deconfuse ourselves. In 1947, that same United Nations comes up with something called the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan is a plan to break down part of Israel into parts and say, let's make an Arab state and a Jewish state, and Jerusalem will be an international capital, an international city, excuse me. That is a plan that has been regurgitated for generation after generation. 71 years later, people still talk about what they call a two-state solution. Have you heard that term before? Yeah. Two-state solution. They're talking about a plan from 1947. 1947, well, 17 in 2022, let's leave that aside because I don't want to confuse too much. 1947, before the establishment of the State of Israel. How good was that plan, that two-state plan back in 1947? It was such a great idea. The Jews said, yeah, well, let's do that because the sum of a state is better than no state. Let's do that. But the Arabs said, not a good idea. Instead, we're just going to push all the Jews into the sea. That was back in 1947. The beginning of our War of Independence began before we declared our independence. The day of the United Nations Declaration, General Assembly Partition Plan, the Arab nations, particularly locally here in this area, started to fight with Israel. Our War of Independence had began. The two-state solution has never been more successful than that. It always ends up with bloodshed. The end of that war is in 1949, and I need us to look at our maps because there's a line going through your map in the color green. It goes right through Israel, right through those natural borders of Israel. You see that green line? Okay, can I get some nods if you see the green line? Okay, because the lighting isn't great because we want to show a little quick film. Does anyone know what the green line is called? The green line. Good answer. 100% accurate. The green line is called the green line. That's why we made it green. It has other names as well. The reason it was called the green line is because at the end of our War of Independence, a line was drawn, a ceasefire line was drawn with a green pen. Ceasefire line, what does that mean? It means that that's not a border. That's not an internationally recognized border. That means that in 1947, we all agreed, it's 1949, we all agreed to stop fighting here. And everything that was north, south, and west of that line is internationally recognized Israel. Everything to the east or right side of that line is disputed territories. We're in that area that is considered disputed territories. Now, it's had a lot of different names to it. A lot of the names that are associated with it are, they call it the West Bank. Why do they call it the West Bank? Because Jordan, which by then already was a nation, laid claim to this area. It was the Jordanian Legion who had a military presence here from 48 until 1967. And so they were in control of the area. But it's interesting to note that a term that was never used back then was occupied territories. Nobody said that the Jordanians are occupying this area. What happened in 1967 is the Jordanians were no longer here because there was another war. We've had a bunch of those around here. Wars are a recurring phenomenon. And so there was another war. It was called the SixDay War. Now, I asked this question to the last group with heritage tours that came, and not everybody was correct in answering this question. How long was the SixDay War? 6 days. I heard 7 days. It's actually not a completely bad answer, but it's basically 6 days, okay? If you told me it was 14 days, then I have to send you guys back to have a better breakfast. The 6-Day War turned us from an extreme underdog into a position where we actually had control over this area. And Israel annexed or applied sovereignty to East Jerusalem. Remember that green line? You see how it goes through Jerusalem? When they talk about East and West Jerusalem, they're talking about that green line from 1949. And then in 1967, when Israel gets control and unifies the city. So we have sovereignty over that area. But other areas like Arielle, like most of this region, have not yet been resolved internationally. Israel has not officially applied its sovereignty, and there are many powers that be that are trying to create another Arab state over here and call it a Palestine, which would be not a Jewish Palestine, but an Arab Palestine. That would be the theory. Again, that gets down the road of the two-state solution. I would argue that it's not a solution, but that's kind of the terminology. I want to just ask by a show of hands, or not even by a show of hands, does anyone have any questions about this? Because it's really important that we understand the map in order to understand why it's so significant that we do this visit to Arielle. Please.
I'm still trying to understand a phrase I've heard over the years, and that's Transjordan. Is that prior to 1967, 1947?
Right, so Transjordan was the name given to Jordan before it was Jordan. It was originally called Transjordan because it was the other side of the Jordan River.
And this side?
Now it's called Jordan as a country, Jordan. There was their attempt to extend themselves to the west, which is where we are now, and that was their attempt at sovereignty here was not recognized by the international community, and even they themselves rescinded that claim. They have no claims now to this area, and yet still the world prefers to use the term West Bank, a Jordanian term, right, referring to the West Bank of the Jordan River, because the alternative to calling it the West Bank is calling it the historic term Judea and Samaria. If you call it the historic term, well, then it becomes really clear who the Judeans are, right? They're not Arabs, right? They're not anyone other than the Jewish people. And so it's not PC in the pro-two-state community to call this area Judea Samaria. Please.
Could I ask you, the status of Judea and Samaria upon the declaration of Israel as a state, that was in Israel, wasn't it?
You're 100% correct.
So then the Jordanian occupation of Judea and Samaria was an illegal occupation because it was an aggressive war and they remained in occupation. Now that's unlawful by international law. Did nobody object to that? Did nobody?
You make a great point. And the answer, and just to your point, and I don't normally get into this level of specificity, but I'm glad that you asked. Would the gentleman, your name?
Graham Levine.
Graham Levine is explaining is that Israel gets a bad rap in the international community because they say that Israel is in transgression of international law. And if you say that often enough, oh, I guess it must be true. The only problem with that is that international law only makes sense if it's standard for everyone. If international law singles out only one country, it's not international law anymore, it's prejudice. So the standard operating procedure around the world is when you want to get to a point of understanding what nation is sovereign in a certain area, you go back to the pre-war status, before everyone started fighting. The pre-war status, as you mentioned, Israel, upon its declaration of independence, included this area as well. And that was also based upon that same League of Nations documentation, the San Remo Conference, which said that this whole area is Israel. And so you go to the status quo. If the status quo is this is Israel, so by international law, this needs to actually be Israel, unless determined otherwise. And an interim situation, post-war ceasefire line certainly can't prevent it from being Israel. But people don't like to talk about that. They try to get that out of the international law discussion. But you're correct in your assessment. Please.
In that case, Israel recaptured its territory in '67 and can hardly be regarded as occupied.
Correct.
Because you can't occupy yourself.
Well, for two reasons. You can't actually occupy yourself, but more than that, you can't occupy an area that doesn't have its own sovereignty. This region was previously under the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a country. By the way, it was the West who made all of the countries here in the Middle East. And that hasn't worked out so well, in case you haven't been following the news for the last 100 years. You know, the World War I ended more than 100 years ago. It hasn't gone so well. But anyway, the whole country thing, there was no country here. The Ottoman Empire was followed by the British Mandate, which was followed by Israel's Declaration of Independence. And Jordan's interim presence here, which they again no longer make claim to, so the default is obviously Israel. And so obviously you cannot occupy an area that's yours. You also can't occupy an area that's not a country. So well said. I want to take two more questions before we get into the next phase. Please, I saw some more questions. Yeah.
So is the state of Israel providing basic amenities like electricity, road, law and order, police, fire, medical services here? Who does that?
So I want a great question. Who's providing the services here? So this area is actually broken up into 3 sub-areas called areas A, B, and C. Simple enough to remember. Areas A, and by the way, this was broken up in 1993 under the Oslo Accords. Also, a failed attempt at being a precursor to a 2-state solution. They said, let's give as much independence to a Palestinian Authority, a government without a state. Let's give them as much power as possible. And so in that theory, Area A is under complete Palestinian Authority control. We're going to go out to the balcony before we head on to the buses. We're going to get a glimpse to Area A, a nearby community that's under Area A. Full Palestinian Authority control. Area C, like Arielle where you're sitting, is under full Israeli control. And Area B is under Israeli security control and Palestinian Authority municipal control. We can get into actually how the services work, but I can tell you as a tax-paying Israeli living in Arielle, I get all the services necessary, and whatever services I don't get, so I personally run the Arielle Foundation to make sure that we can raise funds to build wonderful places like the Center for the Performing Arts where you're sitting now, so that we can do more than what government provides. Whether the residents under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority, whether they get those sort of same opportunities, unfortunately history has proven that that's not the case, and they are disenfranchised by their own government. but it is their own government in those areas, a government without a state. I saw hands.
Yeah.
Please.
I'm probably the only one, but I'm really confused now as to what is Palestine.
Okay, great question. There's no such thing as Palestine. There's never been a Palestine. And personally, I hope there never is a Palestine. That's my personal point, but the first 2 points are not personal, they're fact. Okay, Palestine, the origin of the term Palestine goes back to the Romans, which go back to the Philistines. Anyone here ever read the Bible? A bunch of you. Okay, so we've all been to hotel, right? So you've had a chance to read the Bible. And in the Bible, the kind of incessant challenger to a Jewish Israeli sovereignty thousands of years ago were the Philistines. The Philistines came in from the sea, from the Mediterranean Sea. They largely assembled themselves along the coastal plain. And there were certain attempts for them to constantly move over towards the east, and I'm not going to go into all the battles, but that, again, happened frequently. And so when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, they said, how do we rebrand Jerusalem, right? The Palestinian narrative, the concept of rebranding this area as an area other than Israel was not invented in the last 70 years or 100 years. It was invented by the Romans. The Romans rebranded Jerusalem. They called Israel, they called the region Capitolina di Palestina. The word Palestina was a reference, again, let's talk about the Philistines instead of Jerusalem. Let's talk about the West Bank instead of Judea, Samaria. Same deal. And so when this area has been referred to by many different terms over time, the Levant as a geographical region, part of the Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned before. And so the war of terminology is constant. You're all here not only with heritage tours, but Rebel Media, and you understand the sensitivity of terminology. Terminology is the front lines of the media war, if you will, about what goes on here. I actually want to use that point as a segue into getting more specifically into Arielle, okay? Because Arielle is founded, anyone want to guess what birthday we're celebrating this year?
70, yeah.
Right. As a state, we are celebrating 70. In Arielle, we're celebrating the 40th birthday of the city. Okay, Arielle is 40 years old, 40 years young. We're not over the hill, but we are at the top of the hill. As we travel around, you will see us on a mountain range. And so we are at the top of the hill. And 40 years, let's think about that for a second. Let's go back to 1978. What was happening in 78? So Israel was then beginning to broker its first peace treaty in the region with Egypt. Does everybody remember the Camp David Accords? Menachem Begin was the Prime Minister of Israel, Jimmy Carter the President of the United States, and Anwar Sadat the President of Egypt. And Sadat and Carter had a proposition for Begin. They said, let's make peace. We got a great formula for you. We've called it land for peace. You give us land, we give you peace. There are some people who think that the better formula is peace for peace. But anyway, let's leave that aside. That was the formula back then. We've got a great idea. First of all, you, Israel, got control over the Sinai Peninsula in 1967. We, Egypt, want it back. We'll stop fighting with you if you just give us the Sinai. Oh, and another thing. We want to take control. We want to create another Arab state in an area called the West Bank, where we are right now. What does Begin respond? He says, to request number one, I will give you the Sinai Peninsula in return. I will remove all the Israelis living there. I will destroy their communities. You can have the Sinai. But Israel is too small for me to give you also the so-called West Bank. Oh, and by the way, and this is clearly in the minutes of those meetings, it's not the West Bank, it's called Judea and Samaria. That goes back to Begin. Let's look at our maps again for a second. What is Begin saying? You don't see the Sinai on the map, but you can look at it on your Google Maps at your earliest opportunity. It's a big landmass. And by losing the Sinai, we've significantly shrunk Israel to these very, very tight borders that barely we can survive in a challenging neighborhood. But what happens if we shrunk more? Let's imagine that we went back to the Green Line. Look at the distance between the Mediterranean Sea by Netanya and the Green Line. What's that distance? 9 miles. Okay, it was Abba Eban, our kind of foreign minister or legendary minister, who said that those were the Auschwitz borders of Israel. Those are indefensible borders. There's no way that any country can live with a 9-mile width, and our neighbors are not the Americans or the Canadians, kind of, you know, or even the Japanese. We live in a challenging neighborhood, and this is not something that we can survive. And therefore, says Prime Minister Begin, instead of leaving this region, I'm actually going to see to it that Israelis have an opportunity to move here. And so, on August 17th, 1978, we're just a month and a half away from our 40th birthday, the first 40 families come to Arielle. On September 17th, 1978, 1 month to the day later, the Camp David Accords are signed. Camp David Accords are signed with an understanding that in order to create peace in this area, especially with a land for peace model, Israel must have security. That's why Arielle is identified as the prime location. There are other locations at the time as well, but Arielle is slated to grow to a city. Okay, so if the first founders of Arielle come here out of a security need, not for Arielle, but to secure Tel Aviv and the rest of Israel, the city begins to grow from a small community of 40 families, slowly but surely into what will become a city. It's 20 years later. I'm giving you the 40-year history of Arielle now in 4 minutes or less. Then we can break for some questions and hopefully understand what we're about to see today. So the 40-year history in 4 years or less is first, August 17th, 1978. Arielle is founded as a city. 20 years later, in 1998, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, yes, he was the prime minister then also, Prime Minister Netanyahu recognizes Arielle as a city, as a full municipality in Israel. Whether or not this is part of internationally recognized Israel or not, it has a city status. And that begins to bring us from a security orientation to being here into the next phase of Arielle's genesis, which is a consensus community in Israel. An area that no one in Israel will compromise or be willing to compromise. When I say no one and I say consensus, those are relative terms. I know that you guys are on your first full day in Israel today. So have you heard what they say about Jewish folks in general, that if you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions? Have you heard that before? Okay, that's an exponential factor when you talk about Israelis. Okay, so you've got 2 Israelis, you've got a very interesting conversation going on. So there's no such thing as consensus, meaning everyone agrees. Consensus means look at Israeli policy, look at Israeli governments. When Israel has a say, so they do a lot of things to make sure that Arielle isn't going anywhere. It won't be compromised, even if, this is a huge if with many, many question marks, even if a Palestinian state will ever be created. So even under those circumstances, Israel develops infrastructure in such a way to make sure that Arielle is part and parcel of the state of Israel. When peace deals, quote unquote, land for peace deals were put on the table to offer up to 99% of disputed territories to the Palestinian Authority, please take a state, and they of course always said no. The 1%, the small percentage that always would remain part of Israel, included Arielle. So we have many, many examples why Israeli policy will not compromise this location. Remember the basic thesis. You can't compromise this location if you're going to secure the state of Israel. And then I fast forward to the 2018. We started with 78, we went to 98, and now in 2018, Arielle is not only a city that's providing for the local residents, and you're going to see as we travel around the city, we provide not only for the local residents, but for all of the Israeli communities in the area. We're the regional hub. We also provide for our Arab or Palestinian neighbors. And again, terminology is sensitive. Some people call the Arabs of the region Arabs, other people call them Palestinians, because that's how some of them self-identify as a people. I will use the terms interchangeably. Please forgive me if either of the terms is offensive to you. I have to be PC a little bit every now and then. So the point is, though, that our Arab neighbors have many more opportunities because Arielle is here. From the founding of the city, when Israel connected Arielle to the water grid and the electric grid, that was the first opportunity for our neighbors to be connected as well. And most of them took advantage of the opportunity. Those who didn't complain decades later, oh, Israel's not giving us water or electric. Well, that's because you said no. Moving right along, Arielle, when we go to the industrial park, we're going to see industries, where thousands of Arab Palestinians are employed. They have employment, they have food on their table with full Israeli grade salaries and social benefits because there are Israeli industrialists here. When we go to the other end of the city, by the time we get to the university, we'll see that there's a new medical campus being built on the university campus, which is intentionally built by the east exit to the city so that there's easy access for both Israeli and Palestinian populations alike. And so in 2018, we already see that Arielle is not only a source of prosperity for the locals, not only for all the Israelis of the region, but for our neighbors as well. And so in lieu of some sort of magical peace that's going to come from heaven, we're doing things from the ground up that are benefiting everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of moments for questions, and then I wanted to introduce you to another gentleman.
Will we have an opportunity to get your viewpoint on the BDS movement, which I certainly don't support?
I'll give you something, a little kernel of that, and hopefully you'll get that over the course of this visit. Is everyone familiar with the acronym BDS?
No.
Okay, good. Every time we say BDS, we legitimize the delegitimizers. I'll explain very briefly. The boycott, divest, and sanctions movement is an amorphous movement. It's not an organization. It's a movement. Lots of college kids buy their computers and others who are doing everything they can to boycott Israel. And within Israel, I'm proud to say that you are all sitting in the boycotted capital of the world. Even the seats that you're sitting in right now have been boycotted. Did you know that? You guys came to the boycott capital, first day in Israel. Roni has a great plan for you guys, I'm telling you. What is the boycott capital of the world? So we know that Israel is the most boycotted country in the world. And when academics are asked, well, why Israel? The only democracy in the Middle East, the only place where all of the liberal rights that the academia is looking for are present and available anywhere in this region. So the answer is, of course, well, I don't know. We decided to start by boycotting someone. A very awkward answer indeed. So the boycott movement singles out Israel, and then within singling out Israel, it singles out specifically the region of Judea, Samaria, aka West Bank. And within this area, you're not just going to boycott every five and dime on a corner, you have to boycott things that are boycott worthy. So what's boycott worthy? Well, our university with 15,000 students, that's worth boycotting. That gives you a lot of attention because we're always in international conferences. Let's boycott the people going to the international conferences. Our industrial park, which we're going to see shortly, is also boycotted. The products coming from the area are boycotted because let's see if we can undermine the economy. And the Center for the Performing Arts was boycotted by performing artists that didn't want to perform here. By the way, there were 36 people who boycotted us back in 2010 when this center was open. And as a reaction, we've been the most popular Center for the Performing Arts in Israel. No Israeli wants to be caught boycotting us. It's bad for business. Because Israelis know that A, artists aren't supposed to be boycotters. B, if you're going to boycott an area, don't boycott the consensus area in Judea, Samaria that every average Israeli understands is non-compromisable for the very simple reason that Israel needs to continue to survive. So you're boycotting the wrong place. Instead of 36 people who boycotted us back then, we have 185 performances a year with another 550 on the wait list. That's been the case in 2010. It's the case today as well. So the boycott actually helped us a little bit. More things are boycotted. I'm not going to go into all the examples, but we've built enough things in Arielle to draw attention. And so we're boycotted. What do we do about that? First of all, we try not to talk about the boycott because the game that the boycotters are playing, this has everything to do with communications. The game that they're trying to play is a game of delegitimization. They know that they will not paralyze Israel economically. We'll see some examples of that when we go to the industrial park. They will not paralyze us. They probably won't even harm us economically, not significantly. But who wants to do business with somebody who's being boycotted? They want to drag our reputation through the mud. They want to make us sound like South Africa of the apartheid regime. They want to make it sound that the opportunities that we're giving to our neighbors are in some twisted kind of way, some form of apartheid. This is a problem. Momentarily, I'm going to introduce you guys to someone who's actually doing videos to combat this BDS stuff. But every time we say BDS, we give legitimacy to a movement which is designed to delegitimize us. I prefer not to mention them.
I only mention it so you would.
I get it. Yes. No. We're in good company here. You guys are the good guys. I get it. I get it. We're good. Yes.
You mentioned areas A, B, and C. Where would they be roughly on this map?
Great question. So when I say A, B, and C, we would think, well, somebody wants to draw a map where A is here, and B is here, and C is there. But you have to think of A, B, and C as alphabet soup. Okay? It's a mix. I do have larger maps where you can see A, B, and C, and those maps are available, but you can't possibly see it here because it's such a mix. It's a patchwork. And even as we drive to the industrial park, we're going to see areas A, B, and C just on the small little drive, and you'll see how close-knit everything is. So it's not like you can just draw a line and say, hey, you folks go there, and you folks go there. Yes?
Are there lots of checkpoints between A, B, and B, and C, and C, and A?
So checkpoints have been receding over the last several years. Israel is trying to implement a policy of maximum mobility for Palestinians. The primary checkpoints are the ones between both sides of the Green Line, and they're one directional. In other words, you guys came from where this morning? So you drove past the checkpoint. You didn't notice it because going this way, it's fine. It's like, I grew up in New Jersey, okay? If you wanted to go from New Jersey to New York, you had to pay a toll on the George Washington Bridge. But if you went on the other direction, there's no toll. You get to go to New Jersey for free. New Jersey also has parking and shopping malls. But if you want to wait online and pay a higher tax in New York, you have to pay to get inside. I'm not sure why it is that way, but it is. Okay, so it's kind of a one-directional thing, and those checkpoints are still active. Folks, yes, please.
What happened to the kibbutzes? I haven't heard of them for a long time.
Great question. Kibbutz movement was the cooperatives or socialist cooperatives, which much of Israel's agriculture was developed by the Kibbutz movement, and much of Israel's, essentially the economy, the beginning of the state was largely started by the Kibbutz movement. Today, in 2018, most of those kibbutzim, the ones that still exist, and they usually exist in one form or another, they've been privatized. They've moved from socialism to capitalism. And apparently that just works better. But it was not the case for the beginning of the State of Israel, but we try to keep up with the times.